Is it a challenge for you to keep your watercolor and sketching simple and loose? Join me for some mixed media art journaling and learn 8 tips to keep your watercolor simple and loose. I'll also show you how you can use gel printables, which is a new product in my shop at notableink.com. I lost my mojo a while back, and so I haven't posted videos in a long time. This was a project that I did that you can see I quickly gave up on, and we're going to do a cover-up today. Today's video will cover the art journaling on the left page, and I'll put the second page in another video so that this isn't too long. I've grabbed a selection of washi tapes from the washi tape shop, and I have one of my gel printables here, which, as I said, is a new product in my shop. The first 3 collections are Terra, Terra, and Press Leaves. What these are gel prints that I created with my 8x10 gel press, and what I found is that I didn't want to just use them for my scrapbooking and my mixed media and my cards because I wanted to be able to use that same page over and over. So I scanned them in and digitized them. Here you can see that I took those gel printables and I printed them on dictionary pages, ledger paper, dotted notebook paper, wood grain, vellum, a selection of regular copy paper, and then also some cardstock. Using gel printables means that I don't need to store them. I can print off one or as many as I need for a project on any type of paper that I want. I can drop them in the background of a card that I'm making with digital stamps, and I print these at home on my color laser printer so that I'm able to do mixed media projects over top of them and the ink's not going to bleed. So here I printed one of the gel printables from the Terracotta collection on a dictionary page. So I just pulled out a page from the dictionary and I ran it through the manual feed on my laser printer. Because the ink is pretty transparent, you can still see the text, which is perfect. And I love the look of this. So I'm going to start layering this up with some washi tape. And when I tear this one off, it's going to tear off the top layer of that gel printable, which is perfect because that gives it more of a distressed look. My favorite glue for collaging is a clear gel matte medium, and so I'm going to use a media spatula to put some of the gel matte medium underneath the gel printable and get this adhered down. I find a media spatula or a silicone spatula is the easiest way to do it. You can certainly use a brush. I would not use your watercolor brushes. If you have brushes that are good for acrylics or a synthetic brush, I would recommend using that. But I just find it's much easier just to wipe the spatula clean versus trying to clean the medium out of a brush. So that's what I use. So I'll just put a thin layer underneath and go ahead and press that down. I like to have a little bit of dimension in my mixed media pieces, so rather than gluing down this left edge, I'm just going to curl it up a little so that there's a bit of dimension, but it's still going to close easily once I'm done with the page. I decided that I would put just a little bit of gel medium over top of the gel printable, super thin layer, and that's because I want a watercolor on top of this. Now this is an old vintage dictionary page, and I wasn't sure how it would do with water. I got a little bit of the gel medium on the journal book, so I'm just wiping that off because I want the watercolor to absorb into the paper, and the gel medium can act like a little bit of a resist. So I wiped that off. Now generally I don't think that you're usually able to watercolor on top of gel medium, but like I said, I just used a tiny bit. If you had a clear gesso, I could have put gesso on top of it, but I only have a white gesso. I don't have a clear gesso. But gesso is different than the gel medium in that it's absorbent, and so that's used to prepare your surface for painting. So I want to create a loose watercolor bird, and it's going to be very, very simple, this little bird. So my first tip to create loose watercolor paintings is to use a larger brush than what you're used to. Using a larger brush will do a couple things for you. One, it's going to be harder to get details, which means you can't really fiddle around with your painting much. It's also going to hold a lot more water. Because it's a larger brush, you're going to have less control over those details, and with the larger amount of water and holding more pigment, you'll have less control of the paint as well. So get yourself a larger brush if you don't have one, and try some loose color watercolor with that if you've been struggling. The other thing that the tip number 2 also relates to the brush and where you hold the brush. So I'm holding the brush a little further up, kind of like at the top of the ferrule than what I would normally do, but you can hold it even further up the handle, maybe halfway up the handle or at the back end of the brush, and that's going to give you less control over the brush. When you have less control over the brush, you're less likely to get down into those details and try and control the watercolor, which will make you more successful with loose watercolor. So that's something that I would recommend trying if you've struggled with loose watercolor in the past. In terms of this little bird, you can see that I put down clean clear water, a large circle of it, and then dropped in Daniel Smith quinacridone gold. All of the paints that I'll be using today are quinacridone gold, and anytime that I use the watercolor, I'll put the name of it up at the top of the screen so that you can see that. Using a wet on wet technique is the third recommendation I have for loose watercolor. Wet on wet is perfect because you put down the water, you drop in the pigment, and you just let the pigments run. It lets the colors mix together, and they kind of just have a mind of their own. Here I'm trying to control this wing really more than I should, so I'm trying to remind myself to stay loose. The fourth recommendation I have is to use simple shapes in your loose watercolor. So as I said, you can see that I've broken down this bird into 2 very simple fundamental circles. And keeping simple shapes is going to help with your loose watercolor, again, because it's diminishing the detail. Most of the time, if I'm drawing or sketching or painting something, I will look at a photo reference, not only for information on color, but primarily for information on shadows and highlights, proportion, and form. So generally, I'll look at a photorealistic photo. So like a real photo of a real bird or a photo of a real flower. If you're doing loose watercolor, you might want to think about actually pulling up a cartoon, something with really simple shapes, you know, like a flat 2D cartoon or just line art or something like that that doesn't have any detail at all, completely devoid of detail, so that you don't get stuck into or pulled into trying to add a bunch of detail to your loose watercolor painting. The cartoon is usually going to have kind of more fanciful proportions. It's going to have simple shapes, and it's going to make it a little easier for you to keep things loose and simple. I should probably mention that the brush that I'm using is a 3/4 inch oval mop brush from Wonder Forest. Wonder Forest makes my favorite set of brushes. They have a set of the standard brushes that I use, and then Dana came out with the Deluxe brush set, which is what this brush is part of. It has larger brushes in it, so it's a great set for loose watercolor and watercoloring on a larger scale than just the cards that I normally do. So it's great for my journals. And then she also came out with a detail brush set, and I'll be using the rigger brush for the feet on this little bird coming up soon. So even though this is a loose watercolor bird, I still want him to have cute little feet. So I'm going to use raw umber violet and indigo together on the rigger brush. And this is, as I said, from that detail set. And I'm just going to bring down a tiny little line and then 3 little toes. And I'll just bend the toe. Super simple. Again, you really don't need to choke down on it. Sometimes when I'm painting detail, I paint like I'm drawing. And I tend to have a heavy grip on my pens and pencils. And I really do need to learn to loosen up a little bit. So it's a good reminder to all of us to don't choke down on your brush, hold it a little further back, and just relax a little bit more. So you don't have to have like the death grip on your implements. So same thing, I'm doing the same thing with these little toes, and I'm just bending them so that they have a little more character and you can see the joints there. You could attempt to do the legs and the toes in a loose fashion, but I think it's okay to blend your elements. You can have a few areas of detail with your loose watercolor paintings. Totally up to you and what your style is. Of course, he needs something to stand on, so I'm going to go back to the 3/4 inch mop brush, put down some mostly clean, clear water, and you can see that as it touches the feet that they're starting to bleed out a little, and that's totally fine because it adds to that loose watercolor effect. You can also see that the bird's body was still wet when I put the top of the legs in there, so those colors blended together nicely and you don't just have a stark line going straight up into the bird. I really like how the colors blend with that wet on wet technique. The color I'm using now is called Goethite, and it's a beautiful color. It's also from Daniel Smith, and it's super, super granulating. So this is a great color for beach scenes. It's perfect for your sand, and if you're going to use water, cerulean blue is perfect. You can see the swatch of it up in the top right-hand corner of my palette. It's also a granulating color, so those work really well for beach scenes. I decided it would be a lot easier for me to sketch in the beak and the eye rather than attempting to do that with just watercolor. At this point, I've given my bird a few minutes to dry, but it's still just a little bit damp, and you can see that because my pen is not wanting to draw on it exactly like it should. So if you're impatient like I am, then you can always use a heat tool if you have that to just lightly dry the page. Really best though if you can let it air dry. I'm just never patient enough to do that. And this is a good place when you're doing the eye and the beak and the feet. It's a good thing to look at your little cartoon reference or your photo reference to take a look at what the shape of the beak is. Now I'm moving to a smaller brush, and that was a jar of all of my Wonder Forest brushes. This is the number 6 round brush that's from the detail set. Her regular brush set also has a 6 round, but the bristles in that brush are longer and the barrel is thicker. So it has more hairs in it, and this one is a little shorter. Because it's shorter, the bristles are shorter, you actually have more control over the brush, which is what you would want for a detail brush. Now, of course, we're still trying to keep this painting loose, and my bird was already dry. So what I've done here is laid down some clean, clear water right around the bottom of the eye before I dropped in the raw umber violet so that it would spread out and we would still get that soft wet on wet technique. If I had gone straight in with the pigment, I would have had really harsh lines that had a lot of detail to them, and that's not the look that I was going for. Tip number 6 with your loose watercolor is that you can add a few pen sketch elements if you need just a touch of definition, like I did with the beak and the legs. You could even put a few lines in the wing if you wanted, or you can omit all of that and keep it just completely loose. I'm going to speed up the painting a bit and put on a bit of music, and I'll catch you back for mark making, the rest of the tips, and some mixed media. It's funny because as I'm watching this, I can see as soon as I switch to the smaller brush that I'm trying to get more detailed rather than keeping everything loose. Okay, we're finished with painting for now, so I want to add more of a landscape here, and I decided I would do that with collage rather than watercolor. So I'm just adding a bit of gel medium. I've torn up a few more pieces of the gel printable, and I've got some washi tape, and I'll just add some layers for some hills and landscape here. If you guys are enjoying this video, please give me a like and consider subscribing down below. And if you're not familiar with gel printing, with a gel plate or a gel press, I definitely have a bunch of videos with me showing that process. And so I'll be sure to link those either up above in the right-hand corner or in the description down below. So I'm just tearing off the edge of the washi tape. It was looking a little too straight and tidy for me. And here I have a Pigma Micron 08 pen. I'm struggling with this pen. It's running out of ink, so I'm really trying to press hard, and I finally decide I need to just switch pens. So I have the Pigma PN pen here, and another tip that goes along with the watercolor tips of keeping your sketching loose is to not choke down on your pen. You can see I'm holding this pen really tight. This pen also is running out of ink a little bit. But if you want that loose look, or you're struggling to get that loose look, you're too controlled with your sketching, then do the same thing. Hold your pen further up the barrel of the pen rather than down at the tip where you might normally hold it, so that you have less control. For me, I find it's also easier just to double the lines. So you can see as I outline over the lines again, I'm not keeping true to that original line. I'm going outside the lines, doubling the lines, sometimes tripling the lines, so it has kind of a messy appearance. And I like the look of that type of sketching. As I said, I haven't been posting in a while, and I had lost my mojo. Once I finally got my mojo back, I started to design some new stamp sets. So look for a release coming out. Before I do the release, I have all of the artwork ready. I need to have the stamps produced. And before I release them, I need to finish my new website. So I rebranded Notable Ink, and Braylee Quall from Wild Hollow Designs did my branding for me, and I love what she did with my logo. I just love it. So I'm trying to redo my website, which is taking me forever because to save money, I'm doing it on my own, and you guys, it just is taking longer than I would like. But look for a new release. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already, so that you don't miss any details on that. But they're going to be photopolymer stamp sets. And I'm thinking about also releasing the photopolymer stamp sets as digital stamp sets too. Let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. So I decided I wanted to do some mark making here. I pulled out a mini gel plate and I pressed a button into it. I put a bunch of acrylic paint down because I want to use it as almost like a stamp pad and be able to pick up that acrylic paint. And I love this button. I picked this up from Michael's. It was in the closeout section. It was a clearance item, and I loved the texture on the button, and I thought it would be great for mark making. So that's what I'm doing. So you might have a button or some other household items that you can do your mark making with. Bubble wrap is a really popular one. You know, lids of containers that you can use to make circles. Just look around your house and look for textures and things like that. There's so many different things that you can do. Our little birdie needs a blue sky here, so I'm back to the large brush. Of course, the paint that I used on the gel plate was acrylic paint, so it's permanent. It's not going to move or reactivate with the watercolor, and I'm using cerulean blue and indigo here. Now, tip number 7 for loose watercolor is that you can use a blowout technique. I didn't end up doing it in this painting because the bird is already dry. But if the bird was still wet and I joined it up with this blue sky that I'm putting there, those two colors would bleed into each other, like our wet on wet technique that we did on the bird. And you can create these beautiful blowout effects, which is another great thing to do to keep it loose and kind of fanciful. Tip number 8 is while your paint is still wet, you can splatter on a different color paint or the same color paint, and again, because it's still wet, it's going to mix and you're going to get beautiful color blends. It's going to kind of spread out and move organically. So that's another thing that you can do for your loose watercolor. If your sky gets too dark, you can come in with a microfiber cloth and just pick up some of that paint. The last thing that I did to finish off this painting was to add green to the leaves, and I wish I hadn't because I feel like it just dulled everything down. I don't really like the green that I mixed up. So in the second page that I'll show you in the next video, I leave those white and you can see that they just pop off the page so much more. So here's our little bird. I am totally lacking the splatter here. I might have to go back and splatter it because I just feel like it's really missing that. But I love all the textures and the simple sketching, the simple shape watercolors. And here's a little preview of page number 2, where we go away from loose watercolor and go more into the detailed watercolor. And I will tell you, the sketching and painting that I did on page 2 inspired one of the stamp sets I'll be releasing. Thanks so much for joining me, you guys. Be sure to leave me a comment down below and let me know what you think of this process and whether or not you have any additional tips for loose watercolor. I'll see you soon.